This is going to be an exercise in a certain kind of methodology. And part one will be looking at some historical trajectories on the idea of beauty. And if you listen carefully to how I speak about this, even with the title, The Idea of Beauty, should trigger in your mind certain methodologies. Part two then will look at some Latin words for beauty. Not that we're looking for Latin words in the synopsis, but nevertheless. Also, Latin words or names in the synopsis that do seem to refer to the idea of beauty. Part four then will be diving a little deeper into the idea of beauty in the synopsis and certain disputations. And then part five will be some methodological considerations, which is where I really want to do a little bit of analysis with this whole idea of the idea of beauty. And so I will do that with you, I hope, and your feedback at the end. And then there will be a working conclusion. What do I think about the absence or presence of the idea of beauty in the synopsis? There's no shortage of books about beauty in the Western and Eastern Christian theological and philosophical tradition. Just to name a few, just a selection: Justin Coyle, The Beauty of the Trinity, a reading of the Summa Hallensis, Alexander of Hales, and the Franciscans. Ota Gal, Plotinus on Beauty, Beauty as Illuminated Unity and Multiplicity. I'm not sure the pronunciation of Celti or Celti Est, the Stoic Theory of Beauty. Alice Ramos, editor, Beauty and the Good, Recovering the Classical Tradition from Plato to Duns Scotus. Mark Matis, Martin Luther's Theology of Beauty, Reappraisal. Luis Marcos, Restoring Beauty, the Good, the True, and the Beautiful, in the writings of C.S. Lewis. And Mary Beth Ingham, Rejoicing in the Works of the Lord, Beauty in the Franciscan Tradition. David Bentley Hart, The Beauty of the Infinite, the Aesthetics of Christian Truth. In Augustine's opening prayer meditation in the Confessions, he said to God, "You are infinitely beautiful and infinitely strong," 1.44. He said that when he was about 20 years old, we're told. He had read Aristotle's The 10 Categories, but they profited him nothing. He said he, quote, unquote, mistakenly thought he could understand God by way of the 10 predicates. He imagined that God was the subject of his greatness and beauty, quote unquote, that these attributes, quote, inhered in God as in a material thing. Then you realize that God was himself, quote, identical with his greatness and beauty. Augustine's famous discovery about finding God within himself rather than solely without led him to exclaim the famous, quote, "Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you." 10:27-38. Pseudo-Dionysius, 5th, 6th century, inspired by St. Paul, who wrote, quote, "For from him and through him and to him are all things," Romans 11:36. The 5th century Pseudo-Dionysius wrote in the Divine Names, quote, "To put the matter briefly, all being derives from, exists in, and is returned toward the beautiful and the good. Whatever there is, whatever comes to be, is there and has being on account of the beautiful and the good. In short, everything, in fact, derives from the beautiful and the good. Even what is not still there exists transcendentally in the beautiful and the good," end quote. He said, this, quote, "The sacred writers lift up a hymn of praise to this good. They call it beautiful, beauty, love, and beloved," end quote. But he said not to make a distinction between beautiful and beauty when applied to God. It's not as if God has a share in beauty, quote unquote, as humans do. "Beauty bids all things to himself," wrote Pseudo-Dionysius. "God as cause of all is, quote, uniquely and eternally beautiful. God is the, quote, simple but transcendent nature of all beautiful things." He concluded, "The beautiful is therefore the same as the good. Indeed, he is, quote, the one, the good, the beautiful." Alexander of Hales, the Summa Hallensis, posed the following questions. So this is Alexander of Hales and other Franciscans. Are the beautiful and the good fully identical as far as their meaning is concerned? Beauty and the good, are they identical or not? In the section to the contrary, the Summa Hellensis stated that the term good refers to the final cause. Therefore, the meanings of the beautiful and the good are not identical. But the Summa replied by noting a distinction in the final cause, namely that the term beautiful denotes the ability, quote, to please our faculty of perception, but the good, our affective faculty. The good is like a model from which the artificer works toward a final goal. But, quote, beautiful refers to the exemplar itself, as Pseudo-Dionysius would claim. The good then appears to be primarily a final cause. However, from the Summa Hellensis, to the objection that the beautiful imparts the meaning of the formal cause, while the good the meaning of the final cause, one must reply that just as at times one uses the term form to communicate the meaning of the end, and the term acquires the meaning of finality, to the extent that form is the end or term of being, is the same way the term end acquires the meaning of form, to the extent that it is an art and a set of regulations for the artificer or the architect. For an artificer adjusts his or her work having in mind its end. In a similar way, the beautiful puts on the garb of the good, and the good the garb of the beautiful. Although the primary meaning of beautiful seems to be based more on exemplarity, just as the primary meaning of good on finality. That's the end of the quote. In sum, the terms the good and the beautiful seem to be interchangeable. Briefly, Aquinas, he used the idea of fittingness for the persuasive power of beauty in God's creation. According to Bauer-Schmidt, fittingness added, quote, an aesthetic dimension to Thomas's theology. And in the well-known Umberto Eco's Aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas, he concluded that for Aquinas, quote, beauty is the effective cause of being and the final and the exemplary cause of the created world. As Aquinas writes, everything that exists is from the beautiful and the good, which is God, end quote. And then very briefly, Scotus, God is beauty itself. Trent Pomplin, Franciscan Studies, 2008, and this is from the Collatio, or let's say a public disputation or lecture, Collatio 13. Peter Martyr Formigli, 1576, quote, we attribute properties to him such as good, just, beautiful, wise, and others of that kind, because we do not have more excellent things and more splendid names that could be more appropriately or fittingly applied to him, end quote. Jerome Zanchi, 1590, from the same definition of good, they teach that what is beautiful is the same in reality and subject as what is good. For it is from that form that something is both good and beautiful. And for this reason, it is customary to say in the schools that good and beautiful are interchangeable. However, they demonstrate that they differ in reason, because beautiful pertains to the faculty of the soul that knows and understands. Good, however, pertains to the faculty that desires and wills. For things are called beautiful which when seen please, and when understood are approved. Things are called good which are desired and sought. This seems to be consistent, end quote. Jerome further says, Zanchi, hence beautiful things are also called formosa. Therefore, a blind person cannot perceive whether something is beautiful or ugly, but can very easily perceive what is good, pleasant, or useful, and thus can desire goodness, but cannot judge beauty, end quote. Zanchi warned that, quote, the sacred scriptures teach that God can be more easily sought and desired by us than his beauty and glory can be known. He commands us to love him, but warns us not to investigate the glory of his majesty, end quote. Walleus, one of our authors, 1647, in the Locus de Deo, to the assertion that, quote, nature is the cause of all things, Walleus states in the Locus de Deo, if that were so, then, quote, how did order and beauty arise in things when that very nature was devoid of them in itself? And then just one example after the synopsis to continue the trajectory, if I may do that. Samuel Rutherford, 1649, in the Disputatio Scholastica de Divina Providencia, named God, quote, that most beautiful first beauty, God, formosissima illa prima pulchritudo Deus. Then I will go to part 2 and very briefly look at some words for, and I don't need to educate the audience here, who knows far more than I do, especially the Latinists, but these are some of the words that were used in that historical trajectory, Latin words, that I traced, which we do not find in the synopsis. Of course, you know, pulchritudo, beauty. Luther in the Heidelberg Disputation, 1518, also talked about the paradox, beauty and ugly. It's transferred as the beautiful and the ugly. Speciosus or speciosa. Formosa, we saw that, formosissima, shapely, beautiful. Honesta, excellence. Decor is in Pseudo-Dionysus, often translated as beauty. And the one word we do see in the synopsis, ornatus, which we've translated as adornment. Ornatus. Some Latin words and names in the synopsis regarding beauty. I'll just go by disputation, and then we'll go into a little more detail in the disputations. But just an overview, Disputation 6, the nature and attributes of God, 6.5, in other words, 6, thesis 5. We see disposition, arrangement, disponere, dispositio. In 6.5, we see ordinare, ordo. The order and disposition of nature testifies of a powerful master mind and designer. And that's also where we see adornment, ornatus. 6, thesis 43, God's perfections. We see excellentia, praestantia, majestas, whereby God enjoys glory in himself. In Disputation 10, creation of the world, we see the most skillful assembly, aptissima, most skillful assembly. Greatest harmony in 1028, panarmonia. And in Disputation 11 on providence, that most fitting linkage, concatenazione. In 11.4 also, most apt and suitable arrangement, aptissima. And also the argumentum, which we could go back to Aquinas, argumentum ex convenientia, as opposed to arbitrariness. So what is fitting? The fittingness. Man created in the image of God, Disputation 13. Thesis 38, harmonia we see with the mind, the good reason and the will of God, quote unquote. Again, the 1340, thesis 40, harmonia and consensual action of all the parts of the created man. Disputation 15 on original sin, 1529, that harmony in which original righteousness consisted, again, harmonia. And then last but not least, on the incarnation, that excellent display, eximia demonstratio. And now I go to section 4, a little bit deeper now. Heuristic beauty, which was mentioned previously in the morning. Someone mentioned heuristic, the idea of heuristic structures. Heuristic beauty in the synopsis, the 4 causes, can be seen as a most apt, suitable, it's not said this way, but it's understood as a beautiful, you could see it as a beautiful arrangement. There is a kind of beauty in the heuristic structure found in some disputations. The introduction to the Latin English synopsis outlines the heuristic value of how many disputations are arranged. So many are arranged this way. For instance, Disputation 22 arranges the discussion of the gospel around the triune God as, quote, the principal efficient cause, 22.7. God as the efficient cause, 22.8, of this work ad extra. God's mercy and goodwill as the impelling cause, 22.12. The wretched human race as the object of God's mercy. See the contraposition of wretched race and God's mercy. The revelation and proclamation of saving grace as the form of the gospel, and the glory of God as the ultimate goal of the gospel. Note that an ultimate goal is God himself. In 10.6, the efficient cause of the world is in this disputation an agent, namely God himself. In 10.20, the directive cause of creation is God's wisdom. The synopsis characterizes the directive cause as, quote, the meticulous arrangement and sequence of the various forms, end quote. In 10.20, again, the executive cause, God's infinite power. This cause is seen in the new coming about of things. And in 1029, the goal is the revelation of the goodness, wisdom, and power of God, and the everlasting praise of these virtues to all creatures, especially those endowed with reason, end quote. The final cause points to the goal of God as architect or artificer, and this goal is in the mind of God. You can also see a certain beauty, if I may say, the secret and revealed will of God, but here, archetypal and ectypal beauty. In 1.3, we read of archetypal theology whereby, quote, God knows himself and all divine things in his divine way. Likewise, the Synopsis professes that, quote, the glory of God is the highest goal of theology, whereby he has prepared this glory only for himself, because he's all-sufficient unto himself and is in want of nothing. In other words, God takes pleasure in knowing himself, his glory, as well as in being known. In sum, God enjoys the pleasure of knowing himself. And in 1.4, we read that ectypal theology is originary knowledge refracted in created beings, in creation itself, by God's grace. It is, quote, the knowledge that God has either communicated to created beings endowed with understanding in this age, or that he will share in the age to come, end quote. The first, archetypal theology, certainly bespeaks and gives evidence of the idea of beauty, which is God himself, when the synopsis refers to God's all-sufficiency, glory, excellence, and preeminence. That we shall see God, quote, face to face in this life, that is, with our own eyes and in person, and I add, gazing upon the beauty of the Lord. 3, the beauty of order and disposition in the nature of God. 6, Theses 5 and 43. Nature testifies of, quote, the wisest, most generous, and most powerful masterminded designer by its craftsmanship, order, disposition, and there it is, by its adornment and its diverse uses. The word adornment, or ornatus, in this context surely speaks of the beauty of God's creation. In 643, the synopsis speaks of God knowing his perfections, quote, there is excellence and preeminence above all things. There is glory or majesty whereby he enjoys glory in himself. Isaiah 48:11, end quote. And then fourthly, there is beauty of creation, formal harmony and beauty. In 10, Theses 20, 21, and 28. Poliander presided over Thesis 20, which distinguished between God's, quote, directive cause and his executive cause. God's directive cause showcases a, quote, meticulous arrangement and sequence of the various forms. Whenever we hear of God's arrangement, order, sequence of forms, harmony, proportion, and goodness, we approach the idea of God's originary beauty. Thesis 21 spoke of not merely the variety of created things, but of their, quote, precise and wonderful nature. What moved God to create with such precision and wonder was to show forth his wisdom and power, with the result that we stand in awe of his creative power. The original, ultimate end is the glory of God himself. Thesis 28 pointed to the form of the world that God created. The form speaks of, quote, the most skillful assembly and functional arrangement and, quote, greatest harmony of all parts of creation. Here we understand the beauty of the form, function, setting, structure, and harmony of God's creation. That is, through the lens of aesthetics and philosophy, we perceive the beauty of form and function, the setting, the circumstance, the structure, and the harmony of the meticulous systems embedded in God's creation. Harmony implies beauty, and the greatest harmony implies the greatest beauty. We appreciate, for instance, the beauty of the form or function and setting even of a biblical text. Some commentaries have sections on the form and function. Form, let's say, serves the function. Thesis 29 points to the goal of creation, namely the revelation of the goodness, wisdom, and power of God. For the word goodness, one could substitute the word beauty without compromising the integrity and the intent of the thesis. Is this begging the question? I think not, when one considers the historical precedents. The original ultimate goal of creation is God himself. Creatures are to offer, quote, everlasting praise of these virtues. Note that goodness, wisdom, and power are referred to as virtues, not acquired as in humans, but essential. The beauty of providence. In Disputation 11.8, the synopsis used the literary device known as contraposition, that is, opposing contraries to describe God's providential care. Quote, he who cares for humble things does not himself become humble, and he who looks down upon the lowliest does not cease dwelling in the highest places. Psalm 103:19. Further, quote, architects state that large stones cannot be laid well without small ones, so says Plato, end quote. And again, in The City of God, just briefly, Augustine wrote on providence saying, quote, the beauty of the universe is made richer by God's providence through the opposition of contraries. On providence, the synopsis spoke of beauty in terms of the eternal structural order, and that order, most fitting linkage of everything in the universe, most apt and suitable arrangement of all parts. On the place of evil and sins in God's providence, quote, God destines them to some universal or particular good, whether for a display of his mercy or justice or for some other good. By way of this doctrine of providence, quote, the elect come to acknowledge God as most wise, good, and powerful. Originary Edenic beauty in creation, as I call it. If beauty has any association with harmony, then we find beauty in the synopsis. Man created in the image of God was, quote, in harmony with the mind, the good reason, and the will of God. The schoolmen recognized that original sin resulted from the disruption and breakup of that originary Edenic beauty, my word, order and, quote, harmony in which original righteousness consisted. The beauty of the incarnation, thesis presided over the theses on incarnation. The last thesis, 42, finished the disputation by drawing attention to the more remote or distant goal of the incarnation. A remote and distant goal, you'll recall, is an ultimate end that governs and reveals the aim of all the subordinate goals. The remoteness of the goal reminds us that although the goal was not immediately perceived, God had an ultimate end in the incarnation, namely the, quote, excellent display of his, quote, wisdom, justice, mercy, and love for mankind. And then I will go on to the fifth part, and this will be the methodological considerations of this little exercise in tracing an idea. And so I want to look at a few methodologies that would question even the title that I gave, and I did this on purpose. Is there such a thing as the idea of beauty, which somehow traveled through history with all these different theologians I cited? So I'm going to look at a few different methodologies, and you will recognize one of them because Dr. Nila Adrian referred to one of them. One, what would reception history say about this case, the idea of beauty in the synopsis? The first reception history is perhaps more of an enterprise than a method. It concerns interpretation, appropriation, adaptation, and transformation. Companion volumes such as the T&T Clark Companion to Augustine invite us to break bread, companion volume, companis, as it were. Break bread with Augustine, get in conversation with Augustine. When in conversation with ancient or medieval texts which speak of beauty and the idea of beauty, the reader must realize that the authors of those texts have interpreted and adapted them to various audiences. Reception history goes beyond historical context and concerns itself with how theologians and theological movements, communities, the church, in different ages, actively transform and then apply such an idea as beauty. The synopsis authors chose to use a broad range of terms to convey the idea of beauty without using any of the commonly used words of affection for beauty. Secondly, what would retrieval theology say? And we heard that from Dr. Nila. In fact, I have 5 different references here. One of them from John Webster, the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. Chapter 32 is entirely on, quote, unquote, retrieval theology. It concerns itself with history as ressourcement. It concerns renewal, historical continuity, discontinuity. It re-envisages systematic theology in the way it looks at sources and texts for present-day purposes. So this is also for me a trigger, like, should we be doing this? Is this our starting point? As John Webster says, it seeks to, quote, rehabilitate the classical sources of Christian teaching and draw attention to their potential in furthering the theological task today, end quote. It would appear that the Synopsis practiced a mix of these theologies in an attempt to show continuity with the past and for some polemical purposes to show their continuity with the past. Third, what would the approach of the Institute of Philosophical Research, founded by Mortimer Adler in Chicago in 1952? They explain their methodology in great detail. Just a couple of salient points due to time. They say it's, quote, a non-historical study of ideas. The Institute, quote, deliberately abstracts materials and texts, quote, from their historical context and pattern. It views them as if they were all contemporaries, placing the various voices in the past in conversation with one another. Note the difference between putting ourselves in conversation with these four authors or with Augustine, whomever, or those four authors in conversation with their contemporaries or with the past. But this is not us in conversation with them, but they among themselves. The Institute might look at this paper as a modest attempt to achieve their goals. After all, I abstracted the idea of beauty from several authors. And their first publication, which I have, which is very interesting, their first publication in 1958, The Idea of Freedom. My hypothesis concerning the synopsis would be that the absence of the words for beauty does not exclude the author's intent of achieving a display of the idea of beauty in the context of the synopsis. So I entitled this paper not The Idea of Beauty. They have the idea of freedom, but the idea of beauty in the synopsis. In 1625. What about the Cambridge School and Quentin Skinner? Skinner's approach claims that, quote, any statement is inescapably an embodiment of a particular problem and thus specific to its situation in a way that can only be naive to try to transcend, quote unquote. Don't expect the idea of beauty to live on from generation to generation as, quote, a timeless truth. Skinner offered a severe critique of the history of ideas, method which abstracted ideas from their context and the intent of their author. And very briefly, a neo-sophist rhetoric approach. What would they say? They would say there are kairos moments in history, moments of a speech which are situated in a particular moment and context. It is therefore naive to think that we can capture and retrieve past truths about beauty, for instance, in any meaningful sense for today. Why? Because there was a past performance, like going on a stage, achieving your results, saying what you needed to say to that audience on that day, and then you leave the stage. It was a kairos moment. There's no way to retrieve that as some kind of a model for us today, according to this approach. So, a working conclusion. It may be the case that the genre that includes explanatory works, works of affection, orations, are more likely to use the words that we commonly know as translated for beauty when speaking of God and creation than we find in polemical works, such as in the synopsis. We might reason that polemical works, such as the synopsis, were less likely to engage affective attributes, such as the beauty of God, and were purposely avoiding aesthetic appeal. Although there is, I tried to show a bit, I think, aesthetic appeal to the arrangement and the way they discuss the fittingness, suitable and most apt and fit creation and structure of creation that God has embedded in the universe. So finally, the Latin words for beauty, such as pulchritudo, are absent even from, as far as I saw, Richard Muller's Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms. You don't find pulchritudo in there. Another is, the synopsis is perhaps in part a form of an exposition of Scripture, but it did not speak directly of God's beauty. I looked up all of the passages in Scripture that mention beauty, and I looked at the Vulgate and Tremelius and Junius's, which I have with me, translation of the Psalms, and to see what the words were, and I didn't see any of these passages in the index in terms of, hey, here was a biblical text cited, and so the biblical text spoke of beauty. No, I didn't find any of the Scripture passages listed in the index. Rhetoric includes disposition and style, the arrangement of materials, which we find here, to persuade. Perhaps this applies. Polemics and rhetoric to the synopsis. And then finally, according to Microsoft Edge Copilot, ChatGPT 5, I asked the question, quote, the Leiden synopsis avoided the idea of beauty to maintain doctrinal clarity and avoid speculative or dangerous aesthetics. All right, I will end there. Is that funny? I don't know.